So we have Keith Payne from UNC Chapel Hill, my former PhD advisor, who will be in this session on empathy and the extremes, thinking about what it means to have empathy and understand across partisan lines and broadly considering the role of extremism in everyday life. I think this talk about his recent book will interestingly kind of bring it to a conclusion for this session. So thanks for your patience, everyone, and Keith, whenever you're ready to get started.
All right, thanks, Daryl. Can everybody hear me and see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, great. So yeah, I'm going to do something a little bit different. Instead of presenting an empirical talk, I'm going to talk about a book that of mine that just recently came out called Good Reasonable People, and it's about understanding our current divided moment from a social psychological perspective, and in particular, social identity perspective. So the title, Good Reasonable People, is not meant to claim that everybody on both sides are good and reasonable people. Instead, the claim is from social identity theory that all of us insist on believing that we are good and reasonable people, and that the groups that we belong to that make up our social identities are also good and reasonable people. And any new piece of information or any political position or political candidate that we are thinking about has to be processed in a way that adds up to preserving that sort of psychological bottom line, that I'm a good, reasonable person and the groups that I belong to are too. And so we have this tendency when thinking about politics, both in terms of our everyday social interactions and conversations, and also in terms of doing social science around political issues or political behavior, to think about it in terms of issues and ideology. So this person wants higher taxes, that person wants lower taxes, or these people care about taxes, but those other people just care about climate, etc. And we ask people, why do you believe what you believe? And we ask them in terms of ideological reasons, and we ask them in terms of issues and the facts that they might believe or argue about that would back up their issue positions. But we should probably do a lot less of that, I would argue, because we've known from political science and the social sciences for a long time that at least since Converse in 1964, that most ordinary voters don't have anything worthy of the name of a political ideology. Converse argued this back in 1964, that if you ask representative samples of Americans to explain what liberal or conservative mean, they can't tell you. If you simplify it into a multiple choice test, they're close to chance at picking out the right answer. If you measure their opinion on a range of different issues that you would think follow a left-right continuum, then people who take the conservative position on one issue aren't necessarily likely to take the conservative position on another issue, and the people who take the liberal position on one issue aren't necessarily taking the liberal position on other issues. In other words, the intercorrelations between people's positions on different issue opinions are very low, really low, often uncorrelated. But even with those low correlations, you might think, well, people don't follow a traditional left-right dimension, but maybe they still have some idiosyncratic, code that they follow. They still have an ideology. It just doesn't line up with traditional left-right ideology. But if that were the case, you would expect them to at least have that consistent set of opinions over time. But that's not true either. So if you look at longitudinal data, Converse was looking at the National Election Studies panel data over time. Turns out that people flip-flop on their issue positions all the time. So if you ask them what they think, whether they think taxes should be raised or lowered now, and you ask them again 6 months from now, their own responses are almost uncorrelated with each other. So if people were picking their own responses out of a hat, randomly, they would agree with each other, they would agree with themselves over time 50% of the time. And what the data suggests is that actual people's opinions agree with themselves only about 65% of the time. So people are incredibly inconsistent over time. And Converse argued that although some people have what looks like a coherent and a consistent ideology, it's a small minority. He estimated that only about 15% of people have that, and they tend to be more educated, more involved in politics, and they tend to be people like politicians or people who work in politics or academics or journalists. And it creates this trap for us that, a bunch of people like us, academics, who sit around reading the New York Times and thinking about politics all the time, it's hard for us to believe that the vast majority of people in the public don't know what we're talking about, and they don't have any idea of the structure of these issues in any way that matches our own. Now, that was Converse's argument back in 1964. A lot of people thought, well, surely that was a less polarized time. Maybe now people would have polarized left-right issues. So Nathan Kalmo and Don Kinder published a book about 10 years ago today, but in the modern age, in which they replicated all of Converse's analyses using mostly national election studies data. And they found exactly the same thing in the last decade, that people have very little that qualifies as any kind of ideology. And so there were a couple of exceptions, though. I'll get to that in a moment, actually. So why this creates this illusion of ideology in which if you talk to somebody, they seem like they're a liberal or a conservative. If you look at people's survey data, they look like they're a liberal or conservative, at least at any one slice in time. So at time one, you might survey people, and somebody who says they're conservative will say they want lower taxes, and somebody who says they're liberal will say they want abortion rights. And then at time two, you might survey the same people, and the conservative person is still saying conservative things, maybe talking about the border, and the liberal person is still saying liberal things, maybe talking about climate change. But it turns out that there's not actual consistency from time one to time two. It's just that at both times, people are just sort of randomly saying conservative or liberal sounding things, repeating the talking points from whatever is most accessible, whatever they've seen most recently in the news or the echo chambers that they happen to be in. And you can also see evidence for this lack of ideology experimentally in a series of experiments from Lars Hall and colleagues on choice blindness. What they did is they asked people to express a variety of political opinions, and then using a magician's sleight of hand, they took the surveys, reversed a subset of their answers, gave them back to them. So if they said, I want taxes to be lower, they handed them back the survey, and it showed that they had said they want taxes to be higher. And they'd say, well, why did you choose that response? And the vast majority of people would confabulate a response to explain why they endorsed the position that they had just rejected, right? And so both the traditional survey data of Converse and Calmo and these kind of experimental studies suggest that people will give you an answer if you ask them a question about politics, but it's largely like going out on the street corner and asking people about questions about quantum physics. They might give you an answer, but they probably don't know what they're talking about. There are two exceptions, though, to that general finding. Two kinds of questions, both in the Converse data and in the Calmo and Kinder data, do seem to be coherent with each other and stable over time and highly predictive of people's political behavior, like voting. And those two kinds of issues are items related to people's racial identity and the racial attitudes that are tied to that, and their partisan identity, whether they like Democrats or Republicans better. And those two things are themselves strongly correlated with each other. And so people are all over the place when you ask them about issues. They're not all over the place when you ask them about race and identity and partisanship. And what it starts to look like is that these two things are the anchor around which everything else comes and goes. And so I think you can start to ask, why do some people have this consistent racial identity and this consistent partisan identity, and other people have the opposite or contrasting consistent racial and partisan identity? And you could try to explain those in terms of, other beliefs they have or other attitudes they have. But I think it's more helpful to explain that by looking for something exogenous to that person and their beliefs. So how is it that some people just end up consistently preferring Republicans and other people consistently preferring Democrats, and making up all sorts of justifications to rationalize that? And if you look for an exogenous factor, it turns out you can look for a very, very exogenous set of factors that do a good job of explaining it. So what I'm showing you here are called coccolithophores. They are microscopic single cell organisms that float in the ocean, and they're surrounded by a shell of calcium. And turns out that they were extremely common during certain periods of the Earth's history, in particular the Cretaceous period. The Cretaceous period, the term Cretaceous means chalk, and the Cretaceous period is basically Latin for the time of chalk. And if you look at a map of the United States, what you see is that what is now the Atlantic Ocean covered the eastern and southern parts of the country, so that the coastline then is basically the Appalachian Mountains today. And in this very warm Cretaceous period ocean, there were enormous populations of those coccolithophores. And as they died by the trillions, and their little calcium shells floated to the bottom of the ocean, it formed what later became layers of chalk. And so this is the same chalk that you can see on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean in terms of the cliffs of Dover in England. And across the United States in the southeast, you can see there are towns named like Chalk, Texas, and Limestone, Alabama. Chalk is a type of limestone. So why does all this matter? Because it turns out that the areas that were covered by that Cretaceous sea 100 million years ago turned out to be amazing places, the best places on Earth for growing cotton. So cotton is a very fickle plant. It needs two things to grow well. One, it needs long, hot growing seasons, so it's not going to do well in the north, but it also needs non-acidic soil. So this chalk turns out to be an alkaline, it cancels acid, and it makes the soil excellent for growing cotton. And so by 1860, you can see the distribution of cotton here in the United States, and it follows that path of the Cretaceous period sea. And so, of course, where cotton growth expanded, slavery also expanded. And here's a map that Abraham Lincoln used in planning for the Civil War that shows county by county the proportion of the people in that county that were enslaved in the 1860 census. And he used this map for planning for the war because he knew the states that would be that were most economically dependent on slavery would be most committed to secession, and he was right. But it turns out that the data mapped on this map from 1860 predict a lot of interesting things today as well. First of all, they predict voting patterns. Today we know that voting is racially polarized. and that racial polarization has been growing. But that has been something that changed over time. This is a pattern that changed in particular in the 1960s as the Democratic Party rejected the Southern segregationist platform that they had until then, and the Kennedy and Johnson administrations embraced the advancement of civil rights. And so we had this partisan realignment where non-white voters started becoming more Democratic, and white and Southern voters started becoming more Republican, and that's just continued to grow over time. And so this is the pattern that we see today. And if you look at the white-black gap in terms of voting, you can see that overall there's a white-black gap, but outside of the Southeast, it's fairly small, around 10 percentage points. But in the areas that had more slavery in 1860, that gap is enormous, and that's driving a lot of the Trump sort of phenomenon, the racial polarization that we see behind Trump votes today. But it's not just racial categories. It's also racial attitudes that go along with and rationalize group differences. So the most powerful predictor along these lines is the racial resentment scale, used to be called the symbolic racism scale. And, people talk about what this measures in a lot of different ways, but I think the best way to capture what it measures is that it's an explanation of why we have racial inequality, why we have income gaps and wealth gaps that are huge as they are in the United States. And if you take a look at the items here, it's basically saying, if on the one hand, one narrative in this country is that the reason we have racial inequality is because Black people don't work as hard as white people. And the other narrative is that because racial inequality is because of persistent racial discrimination and lack of opportunity. And so if you put these two things together, racial category and racial resentment, this is data from the National Election Studies. The correlation between racial resentment and the probability of voting for Trump is enormous, and it's bigger than any issue related attitude item that I could find in the National Election Studies. It's bigger even than calling yourself liberal or conservative. And if you just do a simple regression equation where you predict vote choice, this is the 2020 data, not the 2024 data. If you predict vote choice simply by the voter's race category and their racial resentment score, you can predict voting with 80%, 85% accuracy. It's pretty astounding. And so we have this situation in which we have these core identities of racial identity and partisan identity, and everything else is sort of tools that people pick up and put down to rationalize and justify their positions based on that, whether we're talking about issue positions, whether we're talking about misinformation, whether we're talking about true information. I don't have the time to go into all of that today, but I go into great length about that in the book. And so on the one hand, people have this feeling that, well, I reason my way to my belief. Why are you saying that it's all predicted by my social identity? And the answer, I think, is that yes, people do reason their way to their beliefs, but we can predict which reasons they'll find compelling based on their social identities, because we know they're going to reason about it in a biased and selective way that adds up to preserving the conclusion that I'm a good, reasonable person and the groups that I belong to are too. And so just to end with the sort of now what, there are a couple of lessons here. I'll take only a moment to touch on them. The first is sort of a glass half full and a glass half empty. On the one hand, there are a number of studies in social psychology that have found that we have hidden common ground. We're less divided on the issues than we think. And that's good in the sense that it provides us a form of common ground that we can use to have maybe productive conversations. But it's bad in the sense that the reason we have more common ground is because we're not really arguing over issues. We're not really arguing over politics. We're arguing over racial identity, but we talk about it in terms of these justifications and rationalizations. One upshot of that is that we should, if we want to have better political conversations across a political divide, we should stop trying to bludgeon others into submission with our facts and our logic, because that's not the game that most people are playing. They're just using words to justify their social commitments. But if you want to get better insight into why people believe what they believe and vote how they vote, it's a better question to ask, how is this other person using their beliefs and their issue positions to defend their identity and their sense that they're a good person and their groups are too? And while we're at it, we might as well take a moment and reflect on how you and I might be doing the exact same thing. So I will stop there. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Keith. We probably have time for about 2 questions before we shift gears. Does anybody here in the room have any questions? I did see one online from Fadi Ida, who spoke at the beginning of the day. He asked, let me find it, sorry. Yes, so he said, great talk. In your work or in the book, he wondered if you considered how core values shift over time for parties themselves. This can be observed in changes to party platforms and the aspects of ideology that shift depending on political opponents or changes in the population at large. Things like LGBTQ rights, abortion, austerity measures on the right, perhaps being a few examples.
Yeah, it's interesting because nobody really saw the change for Democrats and Republicans coming, I think, before the 1960s. And I think people were stunned when, so the Democratic Party had been divided, right? It was basically a labor party in the North and a segregationist party in the South. And then the Kennedy administration championed civil rights, and Johnson ends up he starts as a Southern segregationist, and he ends up championing the Civil Rights Act after the assassination of Kennedy. And I think part of the answer is that it was a lot of randomness and shocks. It was the assassination of Kennedy that persuaded Johnson to take up civil rights. And so I think that in a lot of cases, parties are responding to demographic shifts and in ways that no individual is really in charge of or planning. And so I think it's very interesting to see how these things might change as the country continues to diversify and the Republican Party keeps doubling down on a smaller and smaller proportion of people who are buy into the white nationalism, and the Democratic Party struggles to keep together a coalition of more and more disparate minority groups. So I guess I don't have a simple theory of how the parties change, but I think it happens gradually at first and then all at once as the parties are reacting to different coalitions every electoral cycle.
Great. One more question for Keith. I guess if there isn't one here in the room, one final question for you, and thanks again for visiting us. Thinking about this in the context of something like Karina's talk at the beginning of the session about dynamic norms of empathy and shifting empathy, and some of the earlier panel with Anne and others about the challenges, the normative challenges of trying to embrace empathy across partisan lines. If that's an ask we're comfortable making or not in this current moment, how do you see, I mean, you sort of alluded to it in the last part of your talk, but how do you see your work speaking to normative encouragements to try to cultivate empathy in these cross-partisan spaces?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, so on the one hand, everything I've been talking about is about race and racial identity and racism, and on the one hand, that makes people go, well, why would I empathize across party lines with racists and so on. But I think you also have to, one distinction I like to make is between cartoon villain racism and the way that racism really works in political systems. Cartoon villain racism is the idea that racism is just dislike for people based on sort of a blind, unreasoning hatred based on something shallow like skin color, and that somebody who's prejudiced is going to run around being just randomly mean to every black person they see. And that's not the way that prejudice and racism work. The way it actually works is that people have these social group identities and they rationalize them in various ways. And if you set aside the cartoon villain version of racism and realize that people on both sides are defending our social identities, it's just we have different identities to defend, then I think it's worth trying to understand the other side. I don't know about other folks in the room, but I come from a big family with very divided politics. And if I want to go home for holiday dinners and be able to talk to any of my siblings, I need to find a way to set aside the cartoon villain racism and talk about why why does it seem to serve their identity to have one set of views that my identity, which is not that different from theirs, right, within the same family, is being served in a very different way.
Well, great. That's a wonderful answer. Thank you for taking time to be with us. Yeah, well, great session, everyone, for all the speakers. Thanks again, Keith.